On a September morning in 1987, Walter Hensley walked his fence line the way he did every Sunday, checking for breaks, looking for loose posts, making sure his 60 head of cattle hadn't pushed through anywhere during the week. He'd walked this same fence line for 35 years. His father had walked it before him, and his grandfather before that. The Hensleys had owned this 240-acre farm in Carroll County, Iowa since 1932, when Walter's grandfather August had bought it at a bank auction during the depths of the Depression. The boundary hadn't changed in 55 years, until that morning. Walter noticed it first at the old cottonwood tree, the tree his grandfather had planted in 1935 to mark the northwest corner of the property. The tree was still there, but the fence wasn't. The fence had moved, not by a few feet, by what looked like a quarter-mile. Walter stood there for a long moment, not quite believing what he was seeing. Then he walked the new fence line, counting his steps, measuring with his eyes the way farmers do. By the time he reached the east end, where the fence used to meet County Road 7, he'd confirmed what his gut already knew. 40 acres of his land, his best pasture land, the meadow where his grandfather had grazed cattle, where his father had cut hay, where Walter himself had spent 50 summers working, was now on the wrong side of the fence. Someone had stolen 40 acres of Hensley land. Let me tell you about Victor Kessler, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Victor Kessler had made his money in Chicago real estate during the 1970s, buying cheap buildings, renovating them just enough to raise rents, selling at a profit. By 1985, he was worth somewhere north of $30 million, owned a penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, and had grown bored with the city. He wanted land, not a weekend cabin or a hunting lease, real land, hundreds of acres, maybe thousands, the kind of land that made you feel like a king, that you could drive across in a truck and never see the end of. Iowa farmland was cheap in 19. The farm crisis had broken so many families that you could buy prime acreage for a third of what it had cost 10 years earlier. Victor saw opportunity. He bought the Miller place first, 800 acres that bordered the Hensley farm to the west and north. The Miller family had farmed there for 3 generations before the bank took it in 19. Victor paid cash, $340 an acre. Less than the land was worth, but more than anyone else was offering. Then he started looking at maps. The Hensley farm had something Victor wanted, 40 acres of prime bottomland pasture, right along Brushy Creek, with natural shelter and year-round water. Perfect for the hunting lodge Victor planned to build. Perfect for the private fishing he imagined. Perfect, if only it belonged to him. The old survey maps were unclear. The original 1932 deed described boundaries using landmarks that had changed or disappeared. A stone wall that had crumbled decades ago, a wooden post that had rotted away, a creek bend that had shifted in the flood of 19. Modern GPS hadn't existed when August Hensley bought the property. Modern surveys hadn't been done. Victor saw an opportunity. Let me tell you about the survey, because that's where the theft began. In June of 1987, Victor hired a surveying company from Des Moines, not a local firm that might have known the history, but an out-of-state operation that asked no questions and worked fast. He paid them double their usual rate and made one thing very clear: the boundary should follow the most reasonable interpretation of the original deed. The most reasonable interpretation, it turned out, put 40 acres of Hensley pasture land inside the Kessler property. The surveyors planted new markers, filed new documents with the county recorder, and sent Victor a bill for $12,000. Victor paid it happily. 40 acres of prime bottomland for $12,000 was the best deal he'd made in years. Then he built a fence, not just any fence, a serious fence, 8 feet tall, steel posts sunk in concrete, topped with barbed wire. The kind of fence you build when you want to make a statement. The kind of fence that says, "This is mine now and there's nothing you can do about it." Walter Hensley watched the fence go up from his side of the property line, the new property line, the one that had stolen 40 acres from his family. He watched the workers pour concrete, string wire, hang no trespassing signs every 50 feet. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But he was thinking about something his grandfather had told him a long time ago. Now let me pause here and ask you something. What would you do if someone stole 40 acres of your family's land? Most people would go to a lawyer. Most people would file a lawsuit, try to prove that the survey was wrong, fight it out in court. And most people facing a man like Victor Kessler, a man with $30 million and a team of Chicago lawyers, would lose. Because here's the truth about land disputes. They favor the rich. Surveys cost money. Lawyers cost more. Court cases can drag on for years, draining your savings, eating your time, breaking your spirit. A man like Victor Kessler could afford to litigate forever. A man like Walter Hensley could not. Walter knew this. He'd seen it happen to other farmers, neighbors who'd fought developers or corporations or government agencies, who'd been right but had lost anyway because they ran out of money before they ran out of truth. So Walter didn't go to a lawyer. Not right away. Instead, he went to his barn, climbed into the loft, and opened an old wooden trunk that hadn't been touched in 20 years. Inside were his grandfather's papers, deeds, receipts, letters, photographs, the accumulated records of a life spent farming this land. And somewhere in those papers, Walter remembered, was a story about cast iron stove lids, buried 6 feet deep. Let me tell you about August Hensley, because he's the real hero of this story. August Hensley was born in 1895 in Germany, in Bavaria, near the Austrian border, and emigrated to America in 1920 at the age of 25. He worked as a farmhand in Nebraska for 12 years, saving every penny, living in boarding houses and barn lofts, eating beans and bread while other men drank their wages away. In 1932, at the bottom of the Great Depression, August had saved $2,400, a fortune in those days, when grown men worked for $1 a day. He used it to buy a 240-acre farm at a bank auction in Carroll County, Iowa. The farm had belonged to a family named Morrison, who'd lost it when they couldn't make their mortgage payments. The Morrisons had farmed that land for 40 years, but they'd never had a proper survey done. The boundaries were described in the deed using the language of the 19th century, from the large oak at the creek bend north to the stone pile, east to the corner post. August knew that language was dangerous. He'd seen boundary disputes in Germany, farmers fighting over strips of land a few feet wide. He'd seen men killed over property lines. So in 1947, 15 years after buying the farm, August did something unusual. He called his son Henry, Walter's father, out to the pasture one autumn morning. He had a wagon loaded with something heavy, covered by a canvas tarp. "What's all this?" Henry asked. August pulled back the tarp. Underneath were 6 cast-iron stove lids, the heavy circular tops from old wood-burning stoves, each one weighing about 30 pounds, each one stamped with the manufacturer's name and a date from the 8th. "Help me dig," August said. They dug 6 holes along the property line, each one exactly 6 feet deep. At the bottom of each hole, August placed a stove lid, face up, then covered it with dirt and tamped it down carefully. "Why are we doing this?" Henry asked. August looked at him with eyes that had seen too much of the world's dishonesty. "Because paper burns. Wooden posts rot. Stone markers get moved. But cast iron, buried 6 feet deep, that lasts forever. And it proves we were here first." "How does it prove anything?" August smiled. "Those stove lids came from Germany, from my family's house in Bavaria. They're stamped 8. No one in America made them, no one in America has them. If anyone ever questions this boundary, we dig them up. We show them iron that's been in the ground for decades, iron that couldn't have been planted yesterday or last year. We prove the line was here before anyone thought to move it." Henry remembered that conversation for the rest of his life. He told Walter about it when Walter was 12 years old, the two of them walking the fence line on a Sunday morning, checking for breaks. "Your grandfather was the smartest man I ever knew," Henry said. "He didn't trust paper. He didn't trust government. He trusted iron and time." Walter had listened, filed the story away, and mostly forgotten about it. 40 years had passed since August buried those stove lids. The old man had died in Henry had died in Walter was the last one who knew the story, until Victor Kessler moved his fence. Let me tell you about the confrontation, because it didn't go the way Victor expected. 2 weeks after he noticed the fence, Walter drove his pickup truck to the Kessler property and asked to speak with the owner. He was directed to a construction trailer near the old Miller farmhouse, where Victor was overseeing renovations. Victor came out wiping his hands on a monogrammed handkerchief, wearing clothes that cost more than Walter's truck. He looked at Walter the way city people look at farmers, the way you'd look at furniture or livestock. Something to be managed. Help you with something? That fence you built. It's on my land. Victor's expression didn't change. I don't think so, Mr. Hensley. Walter Hensley. My family has farmed the property east of yours since That fence cuts off 40 acres that belong to me. Ah. Well, Victor nodded slowly, as if this were a common misunderstanding. You're talking about the boundary line. I had it surveyed, Mr. Hensley, professionally. The survey shows that the line is exactly where I put my fence. Your survey is wrong. My survey was done by a licensed company. They used GPS, satellite imagery, the latest technology. They measured from the original deed descriptions. Victor's smile widened. I'm afraid your memory of where the line used to be isn't legally relevant. When Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my grandfather bought that land in 19 markers. What kind of markers? The kind that don't move. Victor laughed. A short, dismissive sound. Mr. Hensley, I'm sure your grandfather was a fine man, but I've got documents, official surveys, legal filings with the county recorder. What do you have? Stories. Walter looked at Victor for a long moment, at the expensive clothes, the soft hands, the arrogance that came from a lifetime of buying whatever he wanted. I guess we'll see, Walter said. He drove home without another word. Now let me tell you about the lawsuit, because that's when things got serious. Victor Kessler wasn't worried about Walter Hensley. He'd dealt with difficult property owners before, in Chicago. People who thought they had rights, people who complained about surveys and boundaries and encroachments. They always backed down eventually. They couldn't afford to fight. But Walter didn't back down. In January of 1988, Walter filed a lawsuit in Carroll County District Court. The complaint was simple. Victor Kessler had fraudulently surveyed the boundary between their properties and illegally seized 40 acres of Hensley land. Walter demanded the return of his property, removal of the fence, and damages. Victor's lawyers, a team of 3 from a Chicago firm, responded with overwhelming force. They filed motions to dismiss, motions for summary judgment, requests for documents, demands for depositions. They made clear that fighting this case would cost more than the land was worth. Walter had no lawyers. He couldn't afford them. He represented himself, typing his responses on an old typewriter, driving to the courthouse to file papers in person, learning legal procedure from library books. The judge, a man named Harold Emerson, who'd been on the bench for 30 years, watched the case develop with growing concern. He'd seen this pattern before. A wealthy out-of-stater using legal firepower to steamroll a local farmer. It happened more often than anyone liked to admit. But there was nothing Judge Emerson could do. The law was the law. If Walter couldn't prove his boundary, he would lose his land. The trial was set for September of 1 year after Walter had first noticed the moved fence. Let me tell you about the trial preparation, because this is where Walter's grandfather's wisdom paid off. In the months before trial, Walter did 2 things. First, he gathered evidence. He found his grandfather's original deed from 1932, yellowed and fragile but still legible. He found photographs from the 1940s showing the fence line where it had always been, with the old cottonwood tree clearly inside Hensley property. He found his grandfather's diary, with an entry from October 9th, buried the markers today. 6 lids, 6 feet deep. Henry helped. The line is set forever. But Walter knew that documents could be challenged. Photographs could be disputed. Diaries could be called self-serving. He needed the iron. So Walter did something he hadn't done in 40 years. He walked the fence line, the real fence line, the one his grandfather had established, not the new one Victor had built, and he counted his steps the way August had taught Henry, and Henry had taught him. 6 markers, August had said, each one exactly 1,320 feet apart. Start at the cottonwood and walk due east. Walter started at the cottonwood and walked due east. At 1,320 feet he stopped. He drove a stake into the ground. Then he walked another 1,320 feet and drove another stake. He did this 6 times, marking the spots where his grandfather had buried the stove lids. All 6 spots were on the wrong side of Victor's fence. All 6 spots were inside what Victor claimed was his property. Walter didn't dig them up. Not yet. He wanted to do that in front of witnesses. But let me tell you about the trial, because it was the most dramatic day Carroll County had seen in decades. The courtroom was packed. Farmers from 3 counties had driven in to watch men who'd heard about the case, men who feared the same thing could happen to them, men who wanted to see if a farmer could actually beat a millionaire in court. Victor Kessler sat at the defendant's table with his 3 Chicago lawyers, all of them in suits that cost more than most people earned in a month. They had binders full of documents, a professional surveyor ready to testify, an expert in deed interpretation flown in from Ohio. Walter Hensley sat at the plaintiff's table alone. He had a cardboard box full of papers, his grandfather's diary, and a request he'd filed with the court 3 days earlier. Judge Emerson called the case. Victor's lawyers went first, laying out their argument with precision. The original deed was ambiguous. The professional survey was authoritative. The boundary should be where they said it was. They presented maps, GPS coordinates, expert testimony. It was impressive. Then it was Walter's turn. He stood up slowly, the way farmers do when they've been sitting too long. He walked to the front of the courtroom and addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, 3 days ago I filed a motion requesting permission to excavate 6 locations on the disputed property. You granted that motion yesterday. I'd like to present the results of that excavation. Victor's lead lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, we object. The defendant was not notified of any excavation. This is a violation of— Mr. Kessler was notified, Judge Emerson said calmly. His lawyers were notified. They chose not to attend. He turned to Walter. Proceed, Mr. Hensley. Walter walked to the back of the courtroom, where 2 men were waiting, local farmers who'd helped with the excavation. Together, they carried in a large wooden crate and set it on the floor in front of the judge's bench. Walter opened the crate. Inside were 6 cast-iron stove lids, each one caked with dirt, each one showing decades of rust and corrosion, each one stamped with German writing and the date. The courtroom went silent. These stove lids, Walter said, were buried by my grandfather, August Hensley, in October of 19. He buried them at 6-foot depth, spaced 1,320 feet apart, along the true boundary of his property. He buried them as proof that would last forever, proof that couldn't be moved, proof that couldn't be faked. He picked up one of the lids, heavy with age, and held it up for the judge to see. This iron came from Germany, from my grandfather's family home in Bavaria. It's stamped 1894, 38 years before my grandfather even bought this land, 94 years before Mr. Kessler built his fence. He set the lid on the judge's bench, dirt crumbling onto the polished wood. I found these lids exactly where my grandfather's diary said they would be. Exactly 1,320 feet apart. Exactly 6 feet deep. And every single one of them is inside the fence Mr. Kessler built on my land. Walter turned to look at Victor Kessler. The millionaire's face had gone pale. His lawyers were whispering urgently, shuffling papers, looking for something, anything, that could explain this. Mr. Kessler's survey says the boundary is where his fence is. My grandfather's iron says different. And unlike a survey, Your Honor, iron doesn't lie. It doesn't take bribes. It doesn't make reasonable interpretations. It just sits in the ground, waiting for someone to dig it up and tell the truth. Walter walked back to his table and sat down. "That's my case, Your Honor. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen the exact moment when someone realizes they've lost? Not just the case, everything. The money, the time, the arrogance, the certainty that wealth could buy any outcome they wanted. Victor Kessler had that moment in the Carroll County courtroom, looking at 6 pieces of cast iron that had been in the ground since before he was born. Let me tell you about the verdict, because it was swift. Judge Emerson didn't deliberate long. He examined the stove lids, compared them to Walter's photographs and diary entries, studied the locations where they'd been found. Then he delivered his ruling. The evidence presented by the plaintiff is compelling and uncontrecting. The cast iron artifacts are clearly of pre-1900 manufacture, consistent with the plaintiff's claim that they were placed by his grandfather in Their locations correspond exactly with the boundary described in the original 1932 deed, properly interpreted. The survey presented by the defendant is hereby rejected as fraudulent. The boundary between the Hensley and Kessler properties is established as the line marked by August Hensley in 1947, as evidenced by the excavated artifacts. The defendant is ordered to remove his fence from the plaintiff's property within 30 days. The defendant is further ordered to pay the plaintiff's costs, plus damages in the amount of $40,000, $1,000 per acre, for illegal use of the land. Additionally, the court is referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential survey fraud. Victor Kessler's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, but the appeal was denied. The evidence was too clear. The iron was too old. The truth was too deep to be dug out by expensive lawyers. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in the courtroom. Victor Kessler sold the Miller property in 1989 at a significant loss. The investigation into survey fraud resulted in the surveying company losing its license and the lead surveyor facing criminal charges. Victor himself was never charged. His lawyers had been careful to insulate him from direct involvement, but his reputation was destroyed. He returned to Chicago, reportedly told associates he was done with Iowa, and never attempted to buy rural property again. Walter Hensley became something of a local legend. Farmers from across the state came to see the stove lids, which Walter kept in his barn, cleaned and oiled, displayed on a shelf next to his grandfather's diary. They asked him questions, shook his hand, thanked him for proving that the old ways still worked. "It wasn't me," Walter always said. "It was my grandfather. He knew this might happen someday. He prepared for it 40 years in advance. I just remembered what he told me." The story spread beyond Iowa. Agricultural magazines wrote about it. A law journal published an article on non-traditional boundary markers. A professor from Iowa State came out to study the site, marveling at August Hensley's foresight. "This is why oral tradition matters," the professor said. "This is why we need to listen to the old farmers, learn from them, remember what they knew, because sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work." Let me tell you about the last time Walter walked the fence line, because it happened in 2003. Walter was 78 years old by then. His knees hurt. His back wasn't what it used to be. But every Sunday morning, rain or shine, he still walked the boundary of his property, checking for breaks, looking for problems, doing what Hensley's had done for 70 years. He walked slower now, but he walked. On this particular Sunday, his grandson Michael was with him, a young man of 25, just back from college, trying to decide whether to take over the farm or get a job in the city. "Grandpa," Michael said, "tell me about the stove lids again." Walter smiled. They were standing at the old cottonwood tree, the one August had planted in The tree was huge now, its branches spreading 50 feet in every direction. "Your great-great-grandfather buried them in 6 lids, 6 feet deep, spaced along the property line. He knew that someday someone might try to take our land. He wanted to make sure we could prove it was ours. But how did he know? How did he know someone would try?" Walter looked at his grandson, at the young man's smooth hands and curious eyes. He didn't know specifically. He just knew that land is valuable, and valuable things attract thieves. He knew that paper gets lost, wooden posts rot, stone markers get moved. But iron in the ground, iron lasts. Iron tells the truth even when everything else lies. And you remembered. 40 years later, you remembered what he'd told you. I almost forgot. That's the thing, Michael. I almost forgot. If I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't walked this fence line every Sunday, I might not have noticed when Kessler moved it. And if I hadn't found those papers in the barn, I might not have remembered what my grandfather did. Walter put his hand on the cottonwood's bark, feeling the roughness, the age, the permanence. That's why you have to pay attention. That's why you have to listen to the old people even when what they're telling you seems like ancient history. Because someday, maybe 40 years from now, maybe next week, you're going to need something they knew. And if you weren't paying attention, if you forgot what they told you, you'll lose something you can't get back. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to stay. I'm going to take over the farm. Why? Because somebody needs to remember. Somebody needs to walk this fence line. Somebody needs to know where the iron is buried. Walter smiled, the same smile his father had smiled, the same smile August Hensley had probably smiled back in 1947 when he tamped down the dirt over the last stove lid. Good, Walter said. That's good. Let me tell you one final thing, because it's the thing that matters most. The stove lids are still there. Not in the ground anymore. Walter had them professionally excavated and preserved, but on a shelf in the Hensley barn, alongside August's diary, the original 1932 deed, and photographs from every decade of the family's ownership. Michael Hensley farms the land now. He walks the fence line every Sunday, just like his grandfather did, just like his great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather did before him. And every year, on the anniversary of the court verdict, the Hensley family gathers at the farm for a dinner. They eat together, tell stories, remember the people who came before. After dinner, Michael takes his children to the barn and shows them the stove lids. These saved our farm, he tells them. Not because they're valuable, they're just old iron, but because your great-great-great-grandfather was smart enough to think ahead. He knew that the truth isn't always obvious. He knew that sometimes you have to bury it deep. Let it wait. Let it be there when you need it. The children touch the iron, feel its weight, trace the German lettering with their fingers. Will we ever need to use them again, they ask. I hope not, Michael says, but if we do, they'll be ready. And if I'm gone by then, you'll remember where they are. How will we remember? Michael smiles, because I'm telling you now, and you'll tell your children, and they'll tell theirs. That's how it works. That's how families survive. The stove lids sit on their shelf, rust brown and patient. The fence line runs true. The land belongs to the Hensleys, and somewhere, 6 feet deep in the Iowa earth, there are 6 holes that used to hold something heavy, 6 empty spaces that once contained the truth, waiting to be dug up and told. That's the story of the invisible boundary. The story of a man who thought he could steal what wasn't his, and a family that had prepared for that theft 40 years before it happened. It's a story about patience, about memory, about the wisdom of old men who knew that some things need to be buried deep, where no one can move them, where no one can fake them, where they'll wait for as long as it takes. Victor Kessler had money. He had lawyers. He had surveys and documents and all the tools of modern power. Walter Hensley had iron. Iron won.